boys and girls. We are getting ready to learn about our newest coin, which is the quarter. It is the biggest coin that we are going to learn about this year. It is silver. It is worth 25 cents and it is called a quarter. On one of the sides of the quarter, you will find a picture of our very first president, George Washington. I would like to read to you a story that gives you a little bit of background about our first president. His name is George Washington, and like I said, he is on the quarter, and he was our very first president in the United States of America. It was a cold winter morning on February 22nd, 1732. This was more than 200 years ago. Inside a Virginia farmhouse, where it was warm and cozy, a special baby boy was born. The baby's name was George Washington. As little George grew up, he loved the farm and all of the animals, but he loved his horse best of all. George had two older brothers who lived away. He lived with a younger sister and three younger brothers. They followed George's every move. "Let's play follow the leader," said Betty. "George is the leader," said John, and Samuel and Charles agreed. George went to a very small country school. He worked very hard. He was one of the smartest students. George was also the most honest boy in the entire school. He grew up very fast. He was bigger and taller than all of the other boys. Everyone looked up to George. Sometimes George would choose games for his classmates to play. "George is a natural-born leader," his schoolmaster would say. In school, George liked to read and to write. He liked numbers, but he liked to make maps and measure land best of all. This is called surveying. George practiced by measuring the vegetable gardens on his farm. Many farmers wanted George to survey their land. It would help them to know how much seed to buy when it was time to plant their crops. George was only a boy of 16, but the farmers trusted him. They knew George was very smart and very honest. "He will do a perfect job," one farmer would say to another. Well, George's big brother Lawrence took him on a surveying trip in the Virginia wilderness. They stayed many cold and rainy nights. There were many wild animals, and George learned how to take care of himself in the woods. Living in the wilderness helped George to become an even greater leader. When he was only 20 years old, he became a major in the Virginia Army. In 1754, a war broke out. French settlers and Native Americans in the Ohio Valley would not let the English settlers have farms there. George Washington was called to help the English settlers. He was now Colonel Washington. He led the English soldiers and they won the war. Everyone looked up to Colonel Washington. One day, George met a lovely lady named Martha Custis. She was a widow with two children. They fell in love and were married in 1759. George and Martha Washington moved into a beautiful mansion in Mount Vernon, Virginia. They had many parties, laughter, and fun in their home. But Colonel Washington was soon called to war again. It was 1775. America was a very small country with only 13 colonies then. During this time, England ruled America. The rulers in England were mistreating America. They wanted America to pay unfair taxes. A war broke out. The Americans chose George Washington as their leader. The war lasted 8 years. The colonel was now General George Washington. Through his leadership, the American colonies won the war. America was no longer ruled by England. The colonies became the United States of America. Americans were very happy, but the new little country needed a leader. Everyone in the land wanted one and only one man for this job, General George Washington. So they made him the very first president of the United States of America on April 30th, 1789. On the day of his inauguration, which means the day he was made a president, President George Washington rode on a beautiful white horse on his way to the ceremony. Hooray! The people cheered when President Washington stood before them to give his speech. Some people cried with joy. President Washington was a great president. He traveled all over America to see what the country needed. He passed good laws to help America. George Washington was president for 8 years. Afterwards, he went back to his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. He enjoyed good times and laughter again with his wife Martha, his family, and his friends. Americans will never forget the very first president of their land. Boys and girls, now that you have learned about George Washington and how he became the very first president of the United States of America, I'd like for you to find his face on the quarter. You can either cut out the large quarter that you have and glue it together, or you can look at real quarters at your house and see what George Washington looks like on the quarter. Remember, George Washington was the very first president. His face is on the quarter, and the quarter is worth 25 cents.